So once again, welcome to the 9th edition. We kickstart Praxis 9 with a brilliant keynote. And our first keynote speaker is winner of the 2022 Sigma Award. This is the prestigious Global Data Journalism Award. She was the national data editor with the Hindu newspaper and the author of the book Whole Numbers and Half-Truths, which every one of you have got a copy of. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause and welcome Rukmini.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm a bit of an interloper here. My name is Rukmini, I'm a data journalist. And if journalism is trying to uncover what someone somewhere is trying to hide and the rest is PR, I'm very much in the uncovering what someone somewhere is trying to hide share of the ballroom. I'm also an interloper because if communicators here are driven by telling stories, narratives, carrying people along, my world is rooted in data, which tends to be something that automatically makes people's eyes glaze over. But I come here in peace, and I'm here to sort of make the argument, my broad thesis to everyone, is that numbers and stories don't have to be at odds with each other. They go together and they help, coming together helps build trust. I've been a journalist for a long time, and last year my book came out. It's called Whole Numbers and Half-Truths. This is the book and you have it in your bag. What I'm not going to do is give you a whole rundown of all that's in the book. That's for your flight home. But what I'm going to try to do is talk about a few key things that I believe are important to all of us over here, that situate in a way why data matters to storytelling. And if all of us are sort of communally engaged in the business of building credibility and trust, I'm here to also sort of make that pitch, that data can be an important pillar towards not just engaging people, but also building trust. So one of the things that it was pretty hard to convince people about when I started out, which was about 10 years ago, was why anyone should have data in storytelling, whether for broader storytelling or within journalism. That argument has sort of been answered for itself, I think. In the last couple of years in particular, data has really come into its own and made a strong argument for being sort of narratives being centered in data. I'm going to talk about 3 specific reasons from my experiences, both as a field reporter covering the country, as well as a data journalist who sort of tried to bring together what I was seeing in spreadsheets with what I had seen on the field, to make this pitch for why I think data should have a bigger role to play in all forms of storytelling, including journalism and including PR. So I'm going to ask for a quick show of hands here, okay? And there's no wrong answers, and don't be shy. Even if you don't think you are middle class now, how many here feel that they grew up middle class? Show of hands. Yeah. So even today, thanks. So that's the large majority. Today, if you earn more than 8,500 rupees a month, you are in the top 5% of urban India. Now, this is something that's very hard to communicate to each other, and I feel like this is something that only data gives you a granular perspective on the world that anecdotal reporting, your own bubbles never tell you. So if you make more than 8,500 rupees a month, this is national data from the government, no sort of, cherry picking or sort of magic with numbers, you're in the top 5% of the country. So middle class, no, none of us here are anywhere near being middle class. Who owns a car here? You're in the top 8% of the country. Just 8% of the richest Indians own cars. Do you own a computer? You're in the top 9 computer, laptop, anything. There can't be any hands not up. Anyone? Yeah. You're in the top 9.3% of the country. The latest data, just the richest 9.3% of the country owns computers and laptops, including people who've been given by work or school. Have you ever taken a flight for a holiday? You're among the top 3% of urban Indians. Just 3% of urban Indians, the richest 3% of urban Indians have ever taken a flight for a holiday. I'm going to stop bumming you out because I know this is all very buzzkill sort of data. Do you live outside the state where you were born? Live outside the state where you were born? You are one among just 5% of Indians who live outside the state where they were born. So this, really brings into perspective how much the migration narrative and tropes around migrants are vastly overblown. If anything, we have too little migration in a country for our level of development and income. Do you get a weekly off? Do you get a day off? Not Roshan, not now. I mean, generally, do you get a weekly off? Yeah, you're one among less than 10% of Indians who get a day off in the week. And my favorite one, did you have a love marriage? You're one among just 3% of Indians. So, you look around this room and you think that love marriages are universal. But just 3% of Indians, 2.8 actually, I rounded it off to 3. Just 3% of Indians have had a love marriage. So, when we think about even our communication around love in India, we've got to be circumspect about how few people we're actually talking to. So this is the number one reason why I love engaging with good national data. This isn't, tiny surveys that cover just a few people. These aren't online surveys. These are rigorous national surveys. You'll find all of the citations in my book. I don't play with numbers. I'm trying to tell you what good surveys tell you. So my number one reason to engage with data is because it gives me a reality check beyond the world that I live in. Otherwise, the world that I live in, everyone has a love marriage. Many of them are intercaste marriages, which are even more rare within Indian marriages. So that's some perspective from data. The other thing that I enjoy about Indian data and that sort of I feel is essential to anyone in the world of communication is that there are some tired narratives about India that have been handed down from generation to generation, certainly among journalists, even in the world of ads, I'd say, that just do not have a basis in reality. Now, right at the outset, I would like to say that I am in no way making the argument that this shouldn't be an ideal we aspire to. The Amar Akbar Anthony of the 70s is a world I want to live in, maybe not exactly that world where each person marries exactly the person of their same religion, but you get where I'm going with this. So when I make the argument that this is not the country we live in, I'm not saying this shouldn't be the country we live in, and I'm not saying this shouldn't be ideals that we communicate, but let's be a bit more circumspect about the country that we do live in. We like to hold this narrative dear to ourselves, that this is largely a secular progressive country with a fringe majoritarian intolerant element. Unfortunately, that isn't true. That has almost never been true. And the sooner we come to accept it, if we do want to do something about it, the sooner we'll be close to doing something about it based in facts. So just a few numbers for you from this. The vast majority of Indians of both the major religions, or let's say the major religion and the biggest minority religion, see themselves as very different from each other. They are in support of housing segregation. A vast majority of Indians believe that interreligious marriage is not acceptable. In fact, in some surveys, Indians say that interreligious marriage should be banned. They're in favor of bringing laws against this. And here is a point that I feel doesn't get made enough. Again, there's good data. This is all sort of supported with numbers. Younger people in their late teens and early 20s were even more likely than older people to say that interreligious marriage was unacceptable. And neither income nor education made people more likely to accept interreligious marriage. So all of this sort of narrative that's so popular in the media about a young, progressive, forward-looking country that's going to change these old values. It's a great ideal. It's not based in fact yet. This also applies when it comes to intercaste marriage. The majority of Indians believe that intercaste marriage is unacceptable, would not accept one for their own children, and young people don't feel very differently. So, again, if I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but you'd know many intercaste marriages. But intercaste marriages are extremely rare, and people in their 20s are just as likely or rather unlikely to have an intercaste marriage as people in their 90s. So that needle has really not shifted at all. Another sort of tired narrative, particularly dear around elections, is that we are now a post-caste society where people care only about jobs and development, and the old schisms of the past have sort of disappeared and dried up. Unfortunately, that's just not true and not borne out by the data, not borne out by surveys. Also, we asked very poor surveys. So the world of what we're learning from opinion polls is highly restricted by just how bad those surveys are. But even within those surveys, sure, the number one reason people always say what's driving their vote tends to be jobs, economic development, that sort of thing. But the same people also say, a majority of them say that they would like someone of their own caste to be their MP, for example. So this sort of, post-caste young India that we like to believe is going to sort of propel us into the next century or the rest of the century is an exciting ideal, but just is very far from the truth. So again, I'm not going to say we shouldn't aspire to this, but in all of our communication, let's become a little more circumspect about what the data really says and what the country looks like outside our bubbles. I do want to try and make a sort of hopeful point, which is that I do think that data can help us push through our bubbles. And I do also want to make the point that I think that the bubble effect is stronger than most of us even know, even though we know it's quite strong, and is getting worse. We're getting more polarized over time, and is a serious damage to a serious barrier in the face of communication and the spread of information. But here's one sort of, or a couple of sort of hopeful notes that I have in how data can help push past bubbles. For one, having less polarized conversations is my sort of go-to advice to most journalists in trying to break out of bubbles, because just as people choose the information they want, the narratives they want, they are now able to even choose the data they want, because people can sort of slice and dice and cherry pick data to say whatever they wanted to say. One of the sort of hopeful stories to me of the last couple of years has been the breakout of bubbles that happened in terms of COVID reporting. So as you will know, many Indian journalists did a lot of reporting around COVID mortality, which showed that mortality from COVID was much higher than what the official numbers were saying. And I think this actually broke past bubbles for the first time, because in a way it validated what a lot of people were saying. It sort of told them that even if they were being missed by the government, were being missed by numbers, they mattered, they existed, and their experiences did not deserve to be dismissed. So to me, that's an important sort of takeaway in terms of building trust and breaking out of bubbles, which is something I think all of us could try to do more of. I'm not going to lie, it's difficult to get people to pay attention to numbers. One of the first things I'm always told as a journalist is humanize the data, put a face to it, to the point that it's almost become a trope. You have the first paragraph which talks about person A in village B, and then in the second paragraph you pull out and you see why this person is sort of representative of the country. It's almost become a tired trope, but that is because we believe that people find it hard to understand numbers, and journalists have to be creative, communicators have to be creative around this. I'll agree and I'll disagree. Part of the problem is that we teach math and numbers very poorly in this country, and we've taught people to be intimidated and frightened by numbers. I would imagine many of you here, even in the audience, would say that you're probably intimidated by numbers and don't typically turn to data. But I do want to say that I have no training in maths, stats, economics, politics, or anything useful for that matter. So if I can do data journalism or work with data broadly, I'd like to make the sort of argument that everybody should pay more attention to numbers. All it needs is logic and a sort of commitment to the truth. It doesn't really need advanced maths, and there's lots of people with advanced maths degrees out there who you can always call on to help. But even if we do a better job of communicating numbers, stories matter, stories are very important. On the left is a classic painting by Amrita Shergill, which is called, in fact, The Storyteller. And when I saw it for the first time at the NGMA in Delhi, I was so struck by how much it reminded me of a picture of my grandfather telling me and my brother stories when we were small. And the point I want to make is that the grip that stories have over not just children but people across ages is incomparable. Nothing draws you in like a good story, and I'd say that applies to me too. Despite being someone who works almost exclusively with numbers, nothing stays in my mind or moves me like numbers. And I'm trying to make a pitch for more data-based storytelling. So use the numbers to go out and find people who explain those numbers. I'd also say use the numbers to find people who complicate those numbers. I do that a lot in my book. I look at police statistics, for example, which seem to be the neatest and most sort of organized numbers that could exist. And then I go out to courts and I find that the police statistics are a complete lie. So I won't say that stories only need to validate numbers. Use stories to invalidate numbers as well. But some of the same principles should apply. The same sort of integrity that rests with numbers, I want to make a pitch that that integrity should embody storytelling as well. So I just want to talk about a couple of things that I keep in mind, and then I'm going to try to wrap this up soon and move to the questions part of it. Just want to talk about a couple of things that matter both to numbers and to stories and that I'd like to keep in mind. I believe that the rigor and integrity that can be in numbers should be in stories as well. In fact, I don't believe that data and statistics should be held to a higher standard or believed to be telling a greater truth than numbers. You can lie with words, you can lie with numbers. We shouldn't lie with words and we shouldn't lie with numbers. So I'm going to sort of make a pitch for the same sort of integrity that you can expect in data journalism to be there in broader storytelling. I also want to pitch for us to engage people better. I think data journalists, communicators need to keep in mind how much people's time is divided and think hard about how to keep people engaged, particularly those working with numbers. I do not believe that young people do not want to read. They do not want to deal with numbers. My sort of anecdotal experience does not suggest that, but the story being told in an engaging manner is certainly important. If this book had not had stories, I can be very certain that it would not have had readers beyond the world of people who deal with numbers. And I also want to think in multiple ways about what it is that we want people to feel. If we want them to feel informed and engaged, that's important too. If we want them to just sort of sit with the numbers and have it at the back of their mind to pull up when an uncle brings up some outlandish fact on a family WhatsApp group, that's good too. Sitting with the information to be able to do what you wish with it, to me is an important part of data storytelling as well. And I'm going to end with a story that to me sort of encapsulates my thesis, which is that reality is messy. Indian reality is particularly messy. And I don't think either numbers or stories do a good enough job of capturing it. This mess needn't be chaos. This mess could be nuance, and this mess could be, in a sense, humanity. And what we often do is flatten and sort of hollow out interesting people's lives by trying to make them into very crisp narratives. So in my book, in one of my chapters, I talk about a young man called Nitin who was in an intercaste relationship. And I talk a little bit about how difficult he finds this in his life, how he finds, balancing the multiple realities of being a young Indian so complicated. He has to hide his intercaste relationship from his parents. He also has to hide the fact that he now eats chicken because they're vegetarian, and he can't tell his family that he drinks an occasional beer. So all of that those are the sort of multiple realities which he deals with. But towards the end of the chapter, I came back to him with my numbers on intercaste marriage, which showed that intercaste marriage is extremely rare. And I asked him what he felt. I asked him if he felt that this made him an outlier. He told me I was wrong, but not because he didn't believe the data or because he thought it was fake. That's data about marriage, madam, he said, not about love. I think if your data asks people if they have ever fallen in love with someone from another caste or religion, many will say yes. I see that all around me among my friends. But when it comes to getting married, most of us are not ready to leave our families. That's why your data looks like that. And I like this story because in a sense, it sort of demolishes my entire chapter. All of the certainties that came before me, all of the data that I had painstakingly assembled, which showed how these numbers capture how rare intercaste marriage is. But I'm going to try and make this argument that stories and numbers complement each other. They can mess up each other. They can also support each other. But I hope that they can come together to build trust, because increasingly I feel this is the sort of biggest demand or sort of expectation that younger people have from all of us communicators. They want trustworthy information told to them in an engaging way. So happy to talk more about ways we can all make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukmini. Trustworthy information told in an engaging way. Beautiful how you married numbers and stories. Please, I want to invite Arpit Garg, Vice President at Adfactors, to have a conversation with Rukmini.
Thanks, Rukmini, for the wonderful presentation. But before we dive into data and talk more about it, I have to tell you something. I had a moment of epiphany. I was coming up. So there is a phenomena that I have noticed in PR. When my journalist colleagues, journalists who have transitioned to PR, they would often introduce themselves to clients as, oh, I've been an editor, led newsrooms. If it weren't for me, maybe India wouldn't have seen various breaking stories. And now I'm on the dark side. The first time I heard it, I wondered, oh, we were the dark side. And every time I hear it, I would wonder why we are the dark side. But as I was coming up, literally from the dark side to this bright stage, with you from the bright side, it feels really powerful. Now I think I figured it's very empowering to be on the bright side. So on that note, you said something in your book which is very remarkable. You said that a large number of young Indians still live like their grandparents. I think it's a statement many in this audience would like to contest, because we often hear that the young generation today is very different from the young generation of 2 years ago. It's fast changing. So why do you say that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I do often get pushback about that particular observation. And I think in material ways, young people's lives have changed tremendously. And one of the things that sort of happens is that we expect India to change in the same ways that countries around the world have changed, which is when you get richer, more urban, better educated, there is a sort of natural tendency towards more secular, progressive beliefs. And that's not happened. That's not happened for a long time now. And we've not stopped to take stock, which is to say that it isn't going the way it's gone in the rest of the world. Why is that happening? How do we contend with that? You know, where are we now? So I think that's been happening for a while, but we've not accepted that. You know, yes, so I do think the data shows that young people essentially live their social lives extremely similar to how their grandparents did. While on the face of it, it might appear that they go, I don't know, to the movies more or on their phones more. They have the same shares of intercaste marriage as their grandparents did. They hold as strong, if not more conservative views on interreligious mixing as their grandparents did. I sense a loosening around some gender norms. That I certainly do. In fact, one of the most sort of surprising bits in all of this, and here's where, you know, I'm happy to bring in things that complicate certainties, is that young Indians' views on homosexuality have moved in a more progressive direction far faster than anyone anticipated. So there's a question that comes up there, which is that can courts drive change, for example, because we know, because there's, you know, the possibility that the decriminalization of homosexuality drove this change and made it, you know, more acceptable for people to be more accepting of, you know, their gay, lesbian, non-binary children. So it is complicated, but yes, I think the broad sort of notion that we have of this, of what young people live their social lives like, is a bit of wishful thinking, or at least it's a bit of sort of borrowed idiom and expectation of the way lives will move. I mean, even just see movies, I'm constantly bothered by how poorly, or I suppose in a way how well movies reflect Indian life, which is you rarely see an intercaste relationship in Indian movies. So in that way, I suppose it reflects life well. But you know, if by Bollywood, by looking at Bollywood, you would think that love marriage absolutely dominates the young Indian landscape, and it's just very far from truth.
Understood. Thank you. Something that you've talked consistently through the book is three components to data equation. There is data, there is context, and there is interpretation. The latter two are something quintessential to what we do. And while you did talk about humanization and the fact that you have to be honest with the data, but how would you say that we need to string them together? Because there are times where one can get carried away with certain interpretations. So what would you tell this audience as to how to balance all these three out?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think sometimes when journalists are sort of at loggerheads with PR professionals, it can sometimes be about a question of context. And, we are now no longer constrained, all of us, by space in the way that we perhaps were 10 or 20 years ago. So increasingly, there's no justification to not give the full background and context. And I understand that a simple narrative is important both in journalism and communication. Sometimes you need one basic, simple, overarching narrative. But trying to sort of erase complicating factors and context in this is, the truth will out. We know this now. So we know that a million detectives exist in India. And if you're going to try and put out a statement or a news story that hides some data or cherry picks some data, it's going to come out. And it's going to make you look so much worse when it comes out rather than if you just addressed it straight up. So one of the things I try to do in journalism, and this has really been a crash course in the last 2 years because we all went into the pandemic with next to no idea around, epidemiology or all of that and sort of had to learn it on the fly. But one of the ways I handle it is by not feeling obliged to give an answer always and finding it okay to say, here are all of my questions. It could be this, it could be a mix of that. Now I understand that's not always possible in a quick PR release, but I will say that hiding context is just no longer justified. There is a lot of communication that's not about hiding context, but that just is about the context not being known. So that's definitely the case with police statistics in India. I mean, I think all journalists came from a place of good intention where they wanted to highlight crimes against women and they used police statistics for that. But when I began investigating it by looking at court cases, what I ended up finding is that the vast majority of what was being classified as assault was actually consenting young couples whose relationships were essentially being criminalized by their parents' families. Now again, this is, it isn't something we should be surprised by. We do see the broader context of how the agency of young people and their autonomy is something that older people have, continue to want to have a tight control over, particularly in intercaste and interreligious context. So there, I think it wasn't really a question of hiding context, but just of perhaps not being educated enough. So we've got to come to speed, and then we've got to be upfront about it.
Thank you. Something that I noticed in all your interviews, I think you've been very honest about certain kind of reporting. And I've heard you talk about that there needs to be a way to contain the norm of giving certainty to narratives picked up by individual reporters, especially in political reporting. And you have gone to an extent to say that it should die. And what we are seeing in a similar vein, we are witnessing a trend in online journalism wherein a data point, however limited it may seem, is extrapolated to provide a lopsided, polarized view with a clickbait headline. And it's something that in the audience, everyone has had to contend with. So do you see any parallel with what you said with respect to election reporting? And how do you think we can address this?
Yeah, that's really made me think. The part of political reporting that I feel needs to die is the part that involves a journalist sort of parachuting into an area that they know next to nothing about, and then interviewing 3 people under a tree and deciding that those people speak for the constituency and hence tell you what the people are thinking. And yes, I do see the parallels in sort of cherry picking and the sort of headline grabbing sort of work. I will say that I don't think that it's exclusive to online journalism, but we do see more of it now. And here again, I'm going to try and sort of push back a bit by also saying that think of the number of times that you've seen a headline in, say, let's not mention it, a major British tabloid that says chocolate is good for you, wine is good for you, 3 beers are good for you. You know, you see a lot of that as well, which comes from a narrative being spun sometimes by PR professionals around a specific study or a specific product. So journalists are most certainly guilty of doing this. It's going to sort of tie into my earlier point, which is that be free to choose one point as your central point. You know, I don't sort of make the argument ever that I am unbiased or purely objective. In fact, I feel that journalism pursuing this as a virtue is a sort of fool's errand, because we are human and humans have inbuilt biases. What matters is being fair, and I think the pursuit of fairness should be central to journalism, should be central to communication. That might not always involve being objective and unbiased, but at least it involves saying that I am being fair to the question at hand. Maybe I'm not choosing to look at all these other questions because they don't fit in with my bias. They don't, you know, I am particularly interested in gender issues. So maybe my bias is that I'm not looking at enough issues around upper class Indian men. But at least I'm being fair to the question at hand and answering it, you know, without sort of torturing the data to make it confess. So yeah, I do think that this sort of, and you know what, we're already seeing this in online journalism, in the metrics of most major newspapers. The sort of classic old style clickbaity headline, which gives you nothing beyond a yes/no answer to that clickbait question, is dying. That is dying out on its own. Because if there was a time when that grabbed eyeballs, people are way past that. First of all, someone's going to post that headline, a screenshot of it on Twitter, and reply with what the answer to that question is, and kill, you know, your whole clickbait attempt altogether. So I think readers have got, you know, readers have always been smart. They've got much more discerning, and that is dying out. The algorithms of major distributors penalize that sort of clickbaity stuff anyway. So hopefully a combination of readers and the market will make that sort of single point, disingenuous or dishonest journalism die out.
Thank you very much for giving a detailed explanation to that. So staying with the online journalism, there is a spike in behind the paywall news sites. So is there any data that you may have come across which talks about whether it has helped build trust with the readers and audience, or is there a more of distrust that is setting in? Anything that you might have spotted?
I'm going to answer this without data. That's my upfront admission. I think it actually works. Maybe it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but trust drives readers to pay to get through your paywall. The reason that the NYT was able to build a model in which there was, you know, a soft paywall, and then they moved towards, and they're now able to sort of rely on revenues from being behind the paywall, is because of a sort of long culture of trust, reader engagement that they had built prior to that. And I think, you know, the question of what's going to work as a model for Indian journalism is up in the air, and anyone who says they have the answer to it is lying. There's multiple people trying to figure out different models right now. So one is this, that you slowly, you know, your legacy newspapers are doing this. You slowly build trust, you make yourself indispensable, and then you go behind a paywall. There's also the sort of subscriber model that is going on, where you ask people to be part of the journey with you, where you say, we need you to do our journalism, and you sort of take them along. And then, you know, there's also the investor and the sort of grant-driven model. So I think the question of what's going to work is still very much up in the air, and trust is what's going to drive people towards, you know, towards paying for news.
Got it. Thank you. You have been a data journalist for 12 years, and what we've seen that the reliance on data in PR industry has also gone up. So are there any insights that you might have picked up in the newsroom with data journalists and PR professionals when they approach, how they are received? And while you did talk about that sometimes the data that comes from the PR firms is taken with a pinch of salt. So what can be done to make this relationship more trustworthy? What can be done to make it better?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I do think that it needs to, stop being an antagonistic relationship, except when necessary. And I think one of the things that's happened is, in some ways, there's some amount of virtue signaling that goes on among journalists about PR professionals that I have actually had arguments about in the past as well. And my argument with many journalists has been, why would you not accept something that comes through a PR organization while you would be perfectly willing to accept it if it came through an NGO? Sure, the profit model is different over here, but the same sort of journalistic rigor that should apply to evaluating information should apply across the board. So I'm, extremely opposed to this sort of uncritical regurgitation of stories that come from NGOs as well. I think journalists need to do their own work across the board. But specifically, when it comes to PR agencies, and I do sometimes, if there's a big survey, particularly if it asks questions about things the government or big national surveys don't ask about, for example, smartphone usage, that's really something that I think we miss good data on, and we really don't know what young people are looking at their phones, and we're going to need it from a industry organization who's going to come through a PR agency. So I'd say a couple of things. One is offer access to as much data as possible. Don't give just your headline and refuse to part with the data that's gone behind it. If it's anonymized, it's not under any sort of intellectual property restrictions, you should be doing what governments or scientific organizations do, which is say, here is the whole Excel sheet, go to town, have fun with it. I would immediately pay much more attention if a big surveyor gave me their raw data than if I'm not going to do something if I'm only given an email or a press release. I need to see the data for myself, and then perhaps your press release, if written very well, will suggest ideas to me, and I might end up unwittingly moving in that direction. But I do need to see the data for myself, and I think more PR agencies should ask for this from their clients. And this is something that my book misses. What I miss is data from big tech. I have no insights from Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of the people who, all of your big food ordering companies, all of your e-commerce platforms, all of whom I would love to write on. If I could write a version 2 of this book, it would exclusively use data from big tech companies. So any of you here who represent any of the big tech companies, slide into my DMs. I really would love to write about it. So yeah, if you work for a company with access to this data, don't just put out unnamed social media company says that in their last quarter, most people searched for things around dogs or whatever. Give people access to as much data as the company is willing to share, so that some actual data journalism can happen around it. It's really a huge, it's a real pity that data journalists don't get their hands on this information, and it goes in a very sort of curated and cherry-picked way, typically to tech journalists only. So yeah, that's my big complaint.
We'll be mindful of that. Interestingly, you have also talked about that the impact of media is not well understood, and there needs to be more research in that. So in fact, that's also a debate that is an ongoing debate in PR, while there is a lot of work that is already undergone. But to understand and get consensus on how to measure the impact of earned media. So do you think, is there any research that is undergoing which we should look at, or is there a solution that you might have to this?
My solution is that somebody needs to put money into studying this. And I don't mean, PR agencies. I do think that this is a public good, that, the way that we have a Pew in the US, for example, that runs on a charity model, we need to have a non-profit model. We need to be doing much more social science research around things like this than exists right now. And then, then it's no use cribbing that, we only have this information from media industry organizations when we're not putting pressure on the people who need to be doing this research. So yes, I think it's poorly studied. It's studied a little bit around elections again, which is the only time that media organizations are willing to spend money on research is around elections. They'll commission some surveyor to find out the mood of the nation, but it's all geared around election outcomes. There's no sort of independent interest in how people are living their lives unless they're geared towards elections, and that's a pretty sort of unfortunate model with our opinion polling. So though opinion polling asks questions sometimes around what media do you consume, what did you consume in the past, and what sort of impact does it have on you. So we have a bit of that, but there's a lot of correlation here. You know, people who are richer are anyway more likely to be online, are more likely to be consuming English media. So it's very hard to sort of pick apart what part of this is the impact of the media. And yes, particularly because we see so much polarization within the media, it becomes extremely important to study its impact on people, on younger people. You know, otherwise it becomes an anecdotal story of that uncle who watches that frothing in the mouth anchor and then becomes sort of radicalized by it. So yeah, we need to decouple research from elections alone. Election opinion polling has turned into a sort of sports forecasting. You know, all people are interested is in the numbers of who's going to win, and the job that they actually had, which was to figure out what are voters, what are people thinking, and think of them as people before voters, that's really fallen by the wayside, and nobody's investing in that. I would like data to play a much greater role in everyone's communication, whether they are PR professionals or journalists or people having arguments in family WhatsApp groups. I'm sorry to keep repeating this example, but you know what I'm talking about. We are all having them anyway. I think that one of the problems is that we've all been taught to be intimidated by numbers. We've been taught that numbers require a different sort or a higher level of intelligence that your cousin who went to IIT has and you don't have. And I want to, demystify that. And I think the work for that has to happen right from schools. But at our level, I would like us to approach numbers without the feeling that this is something I can't handle. And my answer to it is always, if you can't figure it out by yourself, ask someone else. So there's plenty in numbers that I can't figure out, and I ask someone else. So I would want these to become collaborative teams. On a PR team, in a communications team, bring in someone who understands numbers so that they can help you, A, mine the numbers that you need to tell a more data-driven narrative, and B, make sure that you are telling those numbers in a respectful way without sort of, obfuscating. So dive in, don't be scared, and if you can't do it, and if you feel, you're past that curve right now, hire someone else on your team who can do it. We should all accept, whether in PR or in journalism, we should all accept that there is a crisis of credibility among the broader public. There is a huge crisis of credibility in the eyes of young people. After all my talks around the book, the number one question I get asked is, how do we believe the numbers? How do we believe what's in the news? How do we believe anything? And I think there's good reason. There is so much misinformation out there. There's so much polarization. People feel they're hearing things from one side or the other. They don't know what the truth is. And we've all got to think about how we're going to cut through that. It's not going to happen automatically, but I hope that numbers can be an important sort of tool in our kit in terms of building trust and credibility.
Thank you so much. I think this is very helpful for me in particular. But there is a friend of mine who is a data scientist, and he would often introduce me to his friends with a joke. He says there are 10 kinds of people in the world, literally 10, 1, 0. Those who understand binary and those who don't. And they would categorize me in the latter category. I hope with time I'll learn from you and be in the former category. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.